Research has found that schoolgirls are the most vulnerable to violence in schools at the hands of fellow pupils. Bullying has been in the spotlight in recent days after the death of 15-year-old Lufuno Mavhunga from Limpopo. She was violently beaten by a fellow pupil at Mbilwi Secondary School and she later committed suicide, and this is allegedly due to the attack. For more on this, I'm joined by Deevia Bhana, a professor of gender and childhood sexuality at the University of KZN. A very good afternoon to you, Prof, and thank you very much for your time. Give us a bit of details around the background of the study, what necessitated it, and what it is that you wanted to discover.
So the study is titled "Stop the Violence, Boys and Girls in and around schools across South African primary and high schools." So over the last few years, we have done intensive work in relation to understanding from the voices of whether they are 7-year-old girls and boys or 18-year-olds, in order to understand from their perspectives what their experience of schools and schooling are in relation to bullying and violence. And of course, this did not exclude very key authorities, including teachers, school managers, as well as parents.
And what were some of the findings that came out of this research?
Well, the findings are quite multiple, requiring a multi-pronged approach to interventions. But one of the key findings is that unless we understand violence as a gendered phenomenon, we would not make much headway. The second related to this point is that if we accept that violence is gendered, we need to also accept that understanding violence is also understanding the ways in which boys and girls relate to each other, but beyond that, the ways in which violent gender relations play out amongst boys and between boys, as well as amongst and between girls. The case in Limpopo is indeed an instance where the bullying is between girls, and this too is a gendered phenomenon. So I can just begin with those two very important issues, because in many instances, the sensation created around violence in schools, particularly in terms of the media reporting, the problem seems to be as if it is an individual behavior problem requiring psychological interventions and sometimes even psychiatric interventions, as if there is something inherently wrong with the person. But what we have found, and we do not discount those sort of interventions, we welcome a multi-pronged approach, but what we have found is that the problem relates to the context, to the ways in which power, culture and norms come together in a school with hundreds of young people, and the way these are enacted in terms of building status and privilege, fighting for food, fighting for boyfriends, and of course casting aspersions upon the dignity and integrity of others, and the outcome is always negative.
I'm wondering, Prof, perhaps let's backtrack a little bit so that we can clearly define and distinguish, if there is any distinguishing or difference there, between what constitutes bullying in one end and the power play and the dynamics of power play in environments such as schools, for example. What would distinguish between those two?
So they aren't distinguishable. In fact, researchers often tries to see bullying, again, as I said, as some inherent pattern going wrong in one's brain that leads one to do this sort of bullying. If that was the case, then we would not be having the prevalence of violence in our schools and in our country, for that matter. And of course, accepting that everyone has are psychologically damaged. The real issue here is how bullying and violence, which are deeply connected, are issues around the jockeying and the fight for power. Who is better than the other? How can I access resources from you using physical violence or using verbal abuse or other sorts of sexual violence to get what you want? So that's one aspect of bullying and power relations. But in order to understand that as well, we also need to locate it. Locating this means understanding that the bullying and the violent experiences extend beyond the gates of the school. And so there is a strong and a deep interconnection between how children live more broadly in this country, in communities, in their families, and what they do and experience in schools.
And what would be the difference between bullying between girls and bullying between boys? Do they manifest themselves in different ways, perhaps?
From my research, what I found is that we have an agenda in which to ensure the safety of women and girls in this country. And the President has rightfully come out very strongly in that regard, including the policies and the guidelines that protect children and women and girls. But this is just one dimension of the problem. The problem is not simply about women and girls, and we must not discount the heinous crimes that have been committed against women and girls. But boys too face widespread forms of violence and bullying. Now, the bullying from my research shows that amongst girls, the bullying is about bigger sized girls use their voices, use their